So what does it look to get registered? And these are from bylaws, actually. So you have to graduate from an academic program approved by the board. The board's basically said that any program that's accredited, we'll recognize, so that's the first step. You have to have a degree in social work or a credential in social work equivalent to a social work degree. Not quite sure what that one means. 700 hours social work experience, which generally people get as practicums from their education. Okay? You have to prove good character. We do that a couple of ways. And successful completion of examinations required by the board. So that went in place in about 2010. At that point, the board was pretty clear they were going to implement exams. And then twice since then, they've reaffirmed their intention to do that. It kind of raises the question about what is social work. And I thought I'd sort of go to the most recent definition, which comes from the International Federation. A couple keywords in here. Practice-based profession, academic discipline, promotes social change, development, social cohesion, empowerment, liberation of people, and it goes on, based on the principles of social justice, human rights, collective responsibility, all central to social work, underpinned by social work theories, engages people and structures to address. So this was just approved in August in Australia by the International. And it's interesting going to their website, and I encourage you all to do it, because what follows this definition is about this much text explaining what they mean by this. And the explanation is actually more valuable than just the definition on its own. So let's come back to implementing an exam. 41.1D says examinations required by the board. So the board initially put it into the bylaws, and twice since then has passed motions indicating their intent. The implementation date was decided on by the board on the recommendation of the registration committee. And the implementation date will be September 1st, 2015. Pending, there's a very, very, very small chance that will change, so I'm not going to hold out much hope. So why an exam? Because up until this point, at least in BC, well, sorry, at least in Canada, there's no exam for social work. So what is social work? Is it a profession? I've had people accuse me, funny enough, of trying to professionalize social work. I'll come back to that one. Is it a calling? Is it a trade? Is it a passion? That last one is almost always right. Okay, undervalued. The question's already been answered. When we look across Canada, every jurisdiction in the country regulates social work. 52 states regulate social work. The EU regulates social work. We've got regulation in Australia, New Zealand, and China is moving in that direction. I don't know that they have a formal structure yet which really regulates it. So as soon as government says there's a risk of harm to the public from unregulated practice of social work, and we're going to create a structure to set standards, you're a profession. Governments have already made the decision. Interesting discussion around, so how do we get out of this now? Go lobby government. You go and convince government that in fact social work shouldn't be regulated. And if they were to deregulate any profession, it would probably be the first one in Canada, short of teachers in British Columbia. And they weren't deregulated, they were transferred to a direct government model as opposed to self-regulation. Any questions yet? I've left you all breathless. For us, it's all about, oh, yes.
Yes, I do have a question.
Yeah.
So if you register before this date of 2015, then
Yes.
you don't write the exam?
Yes, absolutely, and I'm gonna come back to that one, okay? We've got about 3,800 registrants currently. Over 50% of them work in health, so for a health authority. Who else is in a health authority? Yeah, are you in health authority? Okay. As a social worker?
No, actually as a social programs officer for.
Yeah.
They're not social workers. Our title is social program
There,
officer.
yes,
And you don't have to have a BCSW to be a SPO.
yes, yeah,
That's equivalent to, similar to what you described
Yeah.
previously.
yeah, 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 yeah. That's interesting model, okay? So she said she's actually not in a social work position. I'm sorry, what's your name?
Social, Rebecca Simpson.
So Rebecca is not, and you've got a social work degree. Social work degree is hired as a social program officer, doesn't have to be registered, isn't regulated, fits in with a whole bunch of other people, because to be a social program officer, you don't have to have a social work degree. What do? Mental health, substance counseling?
Mental health and substance use.
Yeah, mental health and substance use.
Are you,
Right.
are you working in the health authority for the health?
Yes.
In health authority,
Island
yeah,
Health.
yeah,
Okay, we're both social workers with Island Health too.
yeah.
And we have, we challenged that because making it, I mean, everybody has to be registered. So if you want to do your job, you have to be registered by the college. So if you're registered, you are then a social worker,
Yes,
and you need to challenge that. Because it's been done.
and she may not want to challenge that, but that's a whole other story.
But because the employer has said that we all need to be registered because we're not covered by the umbrella anymore.
But you would be in a role that's designated social work, and she's not.
We had
Well,
colleagues
no.
prior to this.
Yeah,
Who were SPOs.
Trust me, if I had my way, I'd say that anybody they hire that has a social work degree should be registered.
Yeah.
Okay? Yeah, let's,
It is challengeable though.
oh yeah, so in health authorities, yes,
Sorry, just by this conversation here, because it is challengeable and the different things, and the conversation before about the exemptions
Yep.
and who's protecting the public, BC is one of the most regulated provinces in this country, and in my involvement with CARF accreditation and the like, it's very easy to get accredited because there's so much regulation going on already that you're already meeting and exceeding standards. And there are a number of bodies in place that oversee, and perhaps even someone like Ministry for Children and Family Development, in having the representative for children and youth who's actually external, so it's not the profession having bias policing the profession, it's actually somebody external.
Yep.
I was a little bit concerned in your conversation, and that I interpreted that because these professions are exempt, that there isn't any public protection. I would say that there's considerable amount of public protection. Children and families, you have Mary Ellen Trapelafon, you have the ombudsperson, you have internal complaints processes within the ministry, that there is avenues and that there is protection to the public with or without registration for those exempted professions. So there are still avenues, as these women here from Island Health have identified, that there is means to challenge things even within Island Health. There is protection with or without that registration.
so does a nurse in MCFD have to be registered?
I'm not a nurse, I can't speak for nursing.
I'll tell you, the answer is yes. An occupational therapist, yes. You can go through the list, they all have to be registered. The MCFD, they do have a complaints process, they have...
I'm sorry, that's a bit obfuscatory, because what I'm saying is there is mechanisms to protect the public, whether or not you register for a social worker or not. And then jumping over and saying, are nurses? That's for me, that's sort of a bit faulty logic in changing the direction of the conversation. I think it's important to identify that there are vehicles and there are mechanisms already in place, with or without registration, where there is a degree of public protection in place. And to present something that there isn't public protection in place, I think is fundamentally a flawed argument in terms of presenting the information. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, and it's a different kind of public protection. The whole discussion around MCFD is a very difficult one. There was a report that just came out of Alberta that showed 300 child deaths in the last 3 years, and they're all regulated there. You know, so will regulation prevent? No, absolutely not. Can we all do a better job? I think so. You know, the representative for children and youth, yeah, she's an independent officer of the legislature. Independent offices are really interesting because they do achieve their budget directly from the legislature. If they don't fund the office, look at the ombudsman as an excellent example. How do they do investigations? Don't get, like, I'm not saying people in MCFD are unqualified or do bad work. I haven't met one person there that doesn't care deeply about their clients, who doesn't care, who doesn't really try their best. That's not what I'm saying. It's very disturbing to me when I get calls from people in MCFD who have graduated within 1 or 2 years. They're in an office on their own without supervision or training because there is nobody else. And I have trouble sort of squaring that away in the whole picture of government. Where's the priorities, right? So I appreciate your comments, and I don't want to say, oh, they're not qualified, or oh, they do bad work, because that's not the case. If you look at many of the representatives' reports where she's highly critical of government, but she names social workers, like not by name, but as the profession. And there's been a very interesting shift in those reports where if you go back to Gove, where Gove actually named individuals, and those individuals were hung out to dry after Gove finished with them. This predates me, but my organization charged them for discipline. So let's see, let's just sort of, put somebody through an inquiry, and then to what end? So yeah, there's lots of issues. Let's go back to health authorities. In health authorities, almost every single profession is regulated. You can go through the list. When they graduate from school, they know they're going to do board exams to get a job as a nurse, physician, psychologist, OT, PT. You have to be registered. Social work was different. Up until September last year, there was no requirement to be registered. Over the last 2 years, 2.5 years, we've seen, anecdotally, I have no hard evidence, hundreds of job losses in social work positions because social work hasn't really defined itself. We don't have really clear standards like nursing does, and we've lost all these jobs to OT and nursing. We still get calls from social workers saying, they want me to go and deliver meds to a patient. I don't want to do it. Well, okay. You kind of have to work through, so are you administering? No, I just have to take them from A to B and drop them off. As soon as the social worker says no, that job goes to nursing, because a nurse will do it. We just had the seniors advocate come and speak to a group of executive directors and regulators. Any idea who's in the office of the seniors advocate? An occupational therapist. Boy, if there was ever a place for a social worker, right? So social work is under attack on a whole number of different levels. And in part, coming back to the exam, in health, what they would say is, well, you're not a profession. You can get registered straight out of school. There's no exam. There's no continuing professional development program. You can't define what you do. In fact, 2.5 years ago when we were getting rid of the exam, a year and a half ago when we were getting rid of the exemption, MCFD asked for job descriptions for social work in BC from the health authorities. Take a guess how many job descriptions there were that used the word social work. Oh, come on. 800. 800 job descriptions in British Columbia that used social work. What would happen is there would be a small gap somewhere that somebody needed something filled, and they'd hire a social worker and write a specific job description. So yeah, we're looking for some consistency. Again, I'm going to go back to respect because social work needs more respect. And I don't know that we'll necessarily get there quickly, but we're trying. So we've got over 50% that are in health, and they do work with the 26 other regulated health professions. Government changed the Family Law Act last year, and when they changed it, they put in a whole bunch of things around family law mediators, family law arbitrators, parent coordinators. And social work is recognized under the Act. You ought to love the Ministry of Justice. They roll out this huge act, and after everything goes in place, they phone and say, oh, by the way, you got to keep track of these people. They have specific educational requirements. Click. So now we're trying to figure out who are parent coordinators and who are family law mediators, because only lawyers can be arbitrators, to try to track that they're doing the hours they have to do to maintain the ability to be those things under the Family Law Act. And then we come to a healthcare provider and qualified healthcare provider under the Adult Guardianship Act and all this other stuff. The Healthcare Consent and Facilities Admissions Act, the Patient Property Act, which you can only do those things if you're registered. Right? AGA is just coming out with an amendment to the statutory patient property regulation, and it's the same kind of thing as the Family Law Act. We now have to track specific social workers who meet limits and conditions established by the college. And on one hand, this is very disturbing to me because what government is doing is they're segmenting social work. They're saying these people are going to be special social workers. They do family law stuff. And these ones are going to do AGA stuff because they met these specific qualifications. And if I go back to when I started my role 3 years ago, it was very clear that social work is one. Once you're a social worker, you're a social worker and you can do anything in there. So it's interesting to me that government is now shifting this without asking us. They just come up with this stuff. And with the AGA, it will come into effect on December 1st. If we don't have limits and conditions, social workers will not be able to do this. Nurses are there, OTs are there, psychologists are there, psych nurses are there. So some interesting dynamics.